For nearly 5 decades, the world was told this asset was untouchable. Tehran swore they would endure anything before handing it over, not crippling economic chokeholds, not precision bunker busters, and certainly not the most suffocating diplomatic isolation of the modern era. To the Ayatollahs, weapons-grade uranium wasn't just a military project, it was their ultimate insurance policy. It was the absolute trump card that forced Washington planners to hesitate, neutralized Israeli strike packages, and guaranteed the Islamic Republic a seat at the head of the table in the Middle East. But the unthinkable just became reality. Iran has officially caved. They haven't just agreed to pause their nuclear ambitions, they are surrendering their entire stockpile of enriched uranium. Let that sink in for a second. We aren't talking about a fragile ceasefire or some loophole-ridden inspection protocol they can tear up next spring. This is the absolute capitulation of the crown jewel of the Iranian regime. The ultimate red line that the Revolutionary Guard swore they would spill rivers of blood to defend, it just vanished overnight. And here is the wildest part of this entire operation. The Pentagon didn't have to put a single pair of combat boots on Iranian soil to make it happen. No Delta Force Halo jumps into fortified mountain bunkers. No D-Day level invasion plans. The strategy that broke Tehran's nuclear spine caught even the sharpest minds on Capitol Hill completely off guard. Stick around, because the tectonic plates of the Middle East just shifted in a way nobody predicted. And the shock waves are only just beginning to hit. To grasp the sheer magnitude of this turning point, we have to look past the science and understand the geopolitical gravity of that uranium. Back in 2015, the JCPOA agreement kept a tight leash on Tehran. Their enrichment was capped at just 3.67%, with a hard limit of 300 kilograms, all under the watchful eyes of continuous global inspections. It was a buffer zone, a mandatory gap between Iran's nuclear ambitions and a fully armed warhead, a gap that Washington, Jerusalem, and Riyadh deemed absolutely critical to global security. But when the United States pulled out of that framework, Iran hit the gas. They shattered the limits, ramping up to 20%, and then a staggering 60% purity. By the summer of 2025, they were sitting on over 440 kilograms of highly enriched material. If processed to the final stage, that is enough fuel to arm more than 10 nuclear warheads. What intelligence agencies call the breakout window, the terrifying countdown from a political green light to an actual mushroom cloud, had essentially evaporated to zero. For the Israelis, this wasn't some abstract policy debate. It was an existential ticking time bomb. For Saudi Arabia, watching their primary rival weaponize the atom meant the complete collapse of the Middle Eastern balance of power. And for the Pentagon, a nuclear-armed Islamic Republic was the ultimate nightmare scenario. Intelligence intercepts showed that if Tehran crossed the finish line, nations like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey were ready to trigger their own atomic programs. It would have sparked the most dangerous nuclear arms race in modern history. To protect this doomsday stockpile, the Revolutionary Guard buried it deep inside 3 subterranean fortresses, heavily engineered to withstand Allied bunker busters. You had Natanz, entombed under massive layers of mountain rock, concrete, and lead, then Isfahan, securing nearly half of their total inventory in sprawling tunnel networks, dropping more than 90 meters below the surface. And finally, Fordo, a facility literally hollowed out of solid mountain, purpose-built to shrug off the heaviest conventional payloads in the American arsenal. Now, the massive airstrikes of June 2025 did inflict catastrophic damage on those sites, burying a huge chunk of that stockpile under thousands of tons of rubble. But here is the brutal reality of nuclear physics that bombs cannot fix. 60% enriched uranium doesn't just disappear. It doesn't magically degrade or lose its lethal potential. That fissile material remains weapons-ready for centuries. The airstrikes pulverized the infrastructure, but the radioactive core survived. Given enough time and funding, Tehran could simply dig it out and reboot the entire war machine. This dark reality forced the Pentagon to brief the commander-in-chief on a ground assault that top brass bluntly labeled a logistical nightmare, making the D-Day landings look easy. Picture this: the 82nd Airborne Division conducting a combat drop into ultra-hostile territory to pave a makeshift runway while taking heavy fire. Meanwhile, elite Delta Force operators and Navy SEALs would have to blow through 300 feet of solid rubble just to access tunnel networks 90 meters below the surface. Picture specialized teams in full hazmat gear creeping through radioactive corridors, hunting for booby-trap cylinders, where a single tear in a suit means lethal contamination, and they would have to sustain this entire operation while getting hammered by a relentless barrage of Iranian ballistic missiles and suicide drones for weeks. Here is the kicker: out of the entire United States Armed Forces, barely a few dozen operators possess the highly classified training required to recover raw nuclear material. Sure, the playbook worked on paper, but in the real world, defense chiefs advised against pulling the trigger. Faced with this suicide mission, the president looked at the map, pivoted away from the mountains, and locked his crosshairs on a 21-mile choke point in the Persian Gulf. On July 1st, 2026, the United States Navy dropped the hammer, initiating an absolute naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran's notorious shadow fleet, the ghost ships that smuggled illicit crude for years, slammed right into an American steel wall. Before this, 97% of Iranian crude flowed to Beijing. Not anymore. Guided missile destroyers intercepted and turned back Chinese-linked supertankers without hesitation. When the vessel Rich Starry tried to run the blockade, it was painted by radar, tracked, and forcefully escorted back into the Gulf. The surveillance grid was flawless. The shutdown was absolute. But American warships did not just choke off the oil. Iran relies on the sea for its basic survival: wheat, rice, medical supplies, and critical industrial components. Everything flows through Hormuz. The blockade severed the ruling government's main arteries all at once. Nothing escaped, and absolutely nothing entered. Inside Tehran's most secure command centers, the ruling clerics were forced to run the brutal mathematics of their own downfall. The countdown was ticking. Within 10 days, crude storage facilities would overflow, forcing a catastrophic shutdown of oil wells, many of which would be permanently destroyed. Within 10 days, the food supply in major population centers would visibly evaporate. Within 10 days, factories stripped of foreign goods would go completely dark. And within 10 days, the state's cash flow, the lifeblood, paying the salaries of soldiers, funding proxy militias, and heavily subsidizing a furious public would flatline to zero. A stockpile of uranium, and it represents decades of sacrifice, leverage, and the illusion of regional supremacy. But what good is a radioactive bargaining chip when your entire economy is in freefall? What good is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps protecting a mountain bunker when the state itself is 2 weeks away from total collapse? The Hormuz blockade forced a terrifying reality check that decades of financial sanctions never achieved. Uranium is a tool for leverage. But the Strait of Hormuz? That is the oxygen of state survival. When forced to choose between the two, survival always wins. Facing the abyss, Tehran finally walked to the negotiating table, and they brought the nuclear keys with them. But there is a massive shadow behind the main headlines, and it is far more lethal than the surrender treaty. This hidden war will dictate if the president's bold announcement actually holds up. The nation of Iran is not a unified machine taking orders from a single throne. It never was. Today, that power structure is more broken and divided than ever before in its post-revolutionary history. On one end of the battlefield, you have President Masoud Pezeshkian. He pushed for a truce long before the conflict reached this boiling stage. He has been going on record, using shocking words for an active leader. warning that the national economy will totally shatter inside of 3 weeks. He represents the realists, the faction fully aware that the ruling clerics cannot survive the financial death spiral caused by the Revolutionary Guard Corps and their aggressive war doctrines. Pezeshkian's stance on the enriched fuel is utterly cold and calculated. Give it up. Shatter the naval chokehold. And keep the government breathing. Is it a massive national disgrace? Yes. Is it a total retreat from 45 years of fierce defiance? Yes. But a disgraced government still draws breath. A government utterly crushed by bankruptcy in 14 days will be erased. Standing across the aisle is the Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, Ahmad Vahidi, and based on leaks from foreign-based Persian news outlets, what Vahidi has been executing during these peace talks is not just loud complaining, it is an aggressive, hostile takeover of state control. Vahidi has been freezing out presidential appointments, forcefully installing his own loyalists into the spy agencies, completely bypassing the legal rules that demand the president's signature. He is heavily pressuring the Supreme National Security Council to swap out its top secretary for a hardliner loyal to the Guard Corps. He is essentially hijacking the executive powers that legally belong to the civilian branch. Pezeshkian officially demanded the return of his rightful executive authority. Vahidi flatly said no. Make no mistake, this is not a friendly debate over policy between two wings of the same state. This is a full-blown coup happening at a crawl, tearing apart a government that is desperately trying to broker a deal with Washington, crush massive civilian revolts across dozens of cities, and sustain a war effort with troops fleeing their posts in droves, all while trying to dodge a total financial wipeout that is exactly 2 weeks away. And hovering over this chaotic power struggle, offering zero clarity or solutions, is the ghost of absolute authority. Mojtaba Khamenei, named the supreme leader after his father passed, is virtually a phantom, almost never appearing out in the open, by law. He is the supreme commander of all armed forces. But on the ground, Vahidi is the one calling the shots. This massive power void, left by a supreme leader unable to function, is the single greatest weapon allowing the Guard Corps to steal the country. Every major choice legally needs a signature that nobody can get. Therefore, the faction bold enough to act without permission wins the whole game. The Revolutionary Guard Corps is more than willing to act without asking. That is the core reason for everything Vahidi is doing right now. Now, drop this nuclear surrender into that chaotic war room. The burning question keeping every Western intelligence agency awake right now is this: can the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps sabotage the deal? On paper, absolutely. They have a massive playbook for this. They could physically block the transfer, weld the bunker doors shut, or drag out international inspections with endless bureaucratic red tape, all while claiming they are cooperating in good faith. They could secretly transport the warhead-grade material to black site mountain complexes that the outside world doesn't even know exist. The International Atomic Energy Agency has warned for years that Tehran's public records do not match their actual nuclear footprint. If they move the material before inspectors arrive, you cannot verify what you never saw, unless inspectors get complete, unhindered access to every single base controlled by the Guard Corps. Tehran could easily hand over half the stockpile and bury the rest. The surrendered uranium makes the global headlines. The hidden reserve becomes their ultimate insurance policy. But running that sabotage playbook relies on one massive gamble. Do the hardliners truly believe they can survive the wrath of the commander-in-chief if he catches them cheating? Playing shell games with nuclear material is a very lethal game to play against a president who currently has 3 nuclear-powered carrier strike groups on station and a fully drafted ground invasion plan ready to execute. The Revolutionary Guard faces 3 brutal options. Every single one is a nightmare. Option 1, accept the surrender. For a military branch that built its entire bloodline on defending that nuclear shield, this is institutional suicide. The great resistance narrative shatters. Their very reason for existing goes up in smoke. However, the state survives, and a breathing government gives the Guard a foundation to eventually rebuild. Option 2, sabotage the treaty and keep fighting. This practically begs the Oval Office to unleash hell. The naval chokehold tightens. Any hope for a ceasefire dies. That logistical nightmare of a ground war is no longer a theoretical briefing, it becomes an active combat order. The 82nd Airborne, elite Delta Force, and Navy SEALs, the entire architecture of the most devastating invasion force assembled since Normandy, drops right on their heads. That is a direct price for choosing deception over surrender. Option 3, a violent internal coup. Overthrow Pezeshkian's civilian government, lock down the country under martial law, and rip up the diplomatic papers. This wipes out the last voices of reason trying to save the state through talks, handing total control to the exact same hardliners who drove the nation into this catastrophe. As defense analysts put it, this is simply driving the final nail into an already collapsing regime. All three paths lead to massive casualties for the Revolutionary Guard. But figuring out which path lets them survive to fight another day is the exact calculation happening in those bunkers right now. They are caught in the dead space between the president's global announcement and an official confirmation from Tehran that still hasn't dropped. The shockwaves of this historic surrender are already tearing up the map of the Middle East, fundamentally rewiring the region's strategic DNA before the ink on the treaty even has a chance to dry. For Jerusalem, Tehran waving the white flag neutralizes the single most terrifying existential threat that has dictated Israeli defense strategy for over 20 years. The nuclear shadow, the apocalyptic scenario that forced generations of Israeli commanders to keep bunker-busting strike packages fueled and ready. Keeping intelligence agencies on high alert for 30 years has officially been taken off the board, just hours after the president dropped the announcement. Benjamin Netanyahu immediately signaled a green light for ceasefire negotiations in Lebanon. That timing is not a coincidence. When you strip away the nuclear umbrella, the entire mathematical equation of Middle Eastern warfare flips. Hezbollah fighting without the backing of a nuclear-armed patron is a drastically different beast than Hezbollah fighting with one. The entire psychological foundation of Tehran's proxy network relied heavily on the unstated promise of nuclear deterrence. Rip away that atomic shield, and every single proxy militia is suddenly forced to recalculate their own survival across the Persian Gulf, in Riyadh and other allied capitals. The immediate reaction is massive relief, but it is heavily loaded with what happens next. The ultimate nightmare, a nuclear-armed Islamic Republic triggering a domino effect where Saudi Arabia and others instantly build their own atomic arsenals, has been completely neutralized. That terrifying proliferation cascade that Western intelligence warned about, it has been halted in its tracks. But the Gulf states aren't just popping champagne and going back to sleep. They are shifting into overdrive. Because the brutal lesson of the last few months isn't just that Tehran lost its nuclear crown. The real lesson is that Iran's entire grand strategy, their iron grip on the Strait of Hormuz, their shadow militias, their so-called resistance economy was actually a fragile house of cards. And in geopolitics, once your enemies smell weakness, they move in for the kill. The most devastating long-term blow to the Iranian regime isn't even the loss of the uranium. It is what the Arab coalition is doing right now to the Strait of Hormuz. For 40 years, the Ayatollahs have used the threat of blockading that 21-mile waterway as their ultimate trump card, holding 20% of the global oil supply hostage to force the world to back down. Now, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have made a ruthless calculation that leverage must be permanently erased from the map. Not deterred, not negotiated, completely erased by engineering their way out of the trap. Right now, a massive web of bypass pipelines and canal megaprojects is tearing across the Arabian Peninsula. These corridors are purpose-built to pump Gulf crude directly to the open ocean, entirely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. We are talking about expanding existing networks and cutting brand new routes, backed by hundreds of billions of dollars and timelines spanning several years. This is not just an economic upgrade. It is a masterclass in geopolitical checkmate. The second that Gulf oil hits the global market without passing through Hormuz, Tehran's ultimate leverage is dead forever, and it is happening without launching a single missile or signing a single treaty. They are literally terraforming the region to make the Iranian threat physically impossible. This is next-level strategic warfare, not conquering terrain, but making the enemy's terrain completely worthless by building around it. Iran's ultimate weapon won't be neutralized by American destroyers patrolling the waters forever. It is going to be buried by Saudi and Emirati bulldozers carving through the desert sands while the cameras are distracted by diplomatic press conferences. This silent geographical revolution is the most permanent defeat Tehran has ever suffered. But the gap standing between the president's declaration and that permanent future is the most volatile window of this entire standoff. The hours and days right after a forced public surrender by an entity like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are not peaceful. They are a ticking clock where the internal calculations made by hardliners reach their most violent and unpredictable peak because the entire foundation of the Guard Corps, the myth they feed their ranks, the Iranian public, and their proxy forces to justify their iron grip. Their massive budgets and their total authority relies on the illusion of unbreakable resistance. That illusion just shattered on the world stage, announced by the American commander-in-chief, framed as Tehran's total submission, and broadcast to every ally and enemy who was assured for 45 years that the uranium stockpile was an uncrossable red line. Right now, Hezbollah is doing the math. The Houthis are crunching the numbers. Iraqi militias are reconsidering their loyalties. If Tehran threw away its atomic shield under financial stress, what does that say about the security guarantees they promised their proxy networks? If the Guard Corps' most holy vow was broken by a 2-week naval chokehold, what is their loyalty actually worth? Once those doubts take root, you cannot erase them. For decades, the proxy web survived purely on the aura of Iranian invincibility and reliability. But an aura, once destroyed, doesn't magically reappear with a press release. It takes decades of hard power to rebuild. Tehran doesn't have decades. They barely have weeks before the financial devastation becomes a permanent death spiral. Meanwhile, the Iranian citizens whose state media falsely stated backed the war effort at 87% are stuck waiting in fuel lines inside a massive oil-producing nation. They are watching the same ruling clerics who demanded bloody sacrifices for regional dominance hand over the very crown jewel of that dominance to the nation they labeled the Great Satan since 1979. The 2009 Green Movement exploded over stolen ballots. The 2019 revolt ignited over spiked gas prices. The 2022 wave caught fire when a young woman died in state custody. Every single one was sparked by one visible injustice that focused years of anger into organized rage. Today's landscape is heavier than all three of those uprisings combined. Total financial collapse, military defeat, and absolute diplomatic surrender are hitting all at once. The spark for the next revolution doesn't even need to be huge. The entire country is soaked in gasoline. So, here is the exact tactical picture. The president announced that Tehran agreed to give up its nuclear core. Tehran has not issued an official confirmation. In that dead air between the announcement and the reality, the Guard Corps is choosing whether to swallow the humiliation or burn the state down. Hardliners are stealing government functions. The civilian president is demanding them back. The supreme leader remains in a coma. The ceasefire clock has run out. The naval barricade holds strong. Crude storage facilities are maxed out. Oil wells are creeping toward a catastrophic shutdown they won't recover from. Frontline troops are deserting. The proxy armies are asking if dying for Tehran is still a smart strategy. The Gulf nations are laying steel pipes that will render the Strait of Hormuz completely useless before the end of the decade. And somewhere deep in those mountain bunkers that Allied bombs buried under rock, the enriched uranium, the absolute pride and shield of the Guard Corps, is sitting in the dark. unverified by Washington and untouched by global inspectors. The United States pulled off a victory that its own top generals considered nearly unachievable. They forced Tehran to yield its most strategic weapon without launching the most massive ground invasion since Normandy. No 82nd Airborne drops. No elite teams crawling through 90-meter-deep radioactive tunnels. They purely locked down the ocean, weaponized the clock against a rotting state, and waited until the brutal math of survival crushed 45 years of fanatic ideology. It worked, at least on paper, at least in one speech, at least for today. But the total silence from the Guard Corps isn't necessarily a white flag. It could easily be the deep breath before the most chaotic decision that organization has ever executed. Because giving up the nuclear fuel means giving up their core identity. And their identity is the only thing the Guard Corps has left. Something unthinkable just went down in Iran. But the surrender itself isn't the craziest part. The real danger is what unfolds next inside the fractured state forced to sign that paper. That final choice is still being debated right now. In dark tunnels, in secure rooms where men who have survived off conflict since 1988 are choosing between staying alive and the fanatic story they have believed their entire lives. The entire globe is watching. And the doomsday clock has never been closer to midnight.